Ever wish you could, like, give your brain a tune-up, swap out some old parts for newer, shinier ones? Well, on today's deep dive, we're going to be talking all about doing just that, naturally.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll be joined by Dr. Wendy Suzuki, a neuroscientist who's like all about unlocking the secrets to a healthier, sharper brain. And get this, her research suggests we're not just stuck with the brain we're born with.
Right.
Intrigued?
Yeah. It's fascinating because I think for years, like, the common belief was that the adult brain, like, couldn't really change that much.
Yeah.
But Dr. Suzuki's work kind of flips that idea on its head, proving that our brains are capable of, like, remarkable transformations throughout our lives.
That's where this whole concept of brain plasticity comes in, right?
Exactly. Brain plasticity refers to the brain's incredible ability to adapt and rewire itself. Think of it like this. Just as lifting weights builds and sculpts your muscles, challenging your brain through new experiences, learning, and even physical exercise can actually change its very structure and function.
It's like having a superpower we never knew we had. And Dr. Suzuki experienced this firsthand. She was on the fast track to becoming a tenured professor, which anyone in academia will tell you is a pretty grueling process. She was feeling burnt out, so she decided to shake things up a bit.
She embarked on a solo river rafting trip down the Amazon. Talk about novelty. This adventurous break ended up being a turning point for her, both personally and professionally.
I bet. So she comes back from this incredible adventure feeling refreshed and decides to join a gym, keep the momentum going. And that's when things get really interesting.
She noticed a remarkable shift in her mental state. Her mood improved, her focus sharpened, and even her writing, something she'd struggled with before, became easier. This personal experience sparked a deep curiosity about the link between exercise and the brain, setting her on a new path of research.
And this is where it gets really exciting. One of the studies she talked about involved these rats. They basically created a rat Disney World filled with toys, other rat buddies to hang out with, the whole shebang. And they compared these privileged rats to those stuck in pretty boring standard cages.
The results were astounding. The rats living in that stimulating Disney World environment actually developed thicker cortexes, meaning they had more synaptic connections in certain brain regions.
Hold on, are you saying their brains got physically bigger just from having more fun?
Precisely. And the areas that showed the most growth, those related to vision, movement, and processing sensory information, all those things stimulated by their enriched environment.
Wow. So basically, giving those rats a more stimulating life actually made their brains physically bigger and more connected. But here's the kicker. They later discovered that they could achieve almost the same results simply by giving the rats running wheels.
That's right. And this is a critical takeaway for us. This research suggests that physical activity, even something as straightforward as going for a brisk walk, can have a profound impact on the very structure and function of our brains. It's like hitting the gym for your gray matter.
Okay, that is mind-blowing. But how exactly does this work? What's the connection between breaking a sweat and actually changing our brain structure?
That's where those growth factors come in. Exercise prompts our brains to release these powerful little molecules that act like fertilizer for brain cells. They promote the birth of new neurons, particularly in a region called the hippocampus, which is crucial for learning and memory.
So it's not just about feeling good physically, it's about giving our brain the resources it needs to thrive. This is amazing news, but what about memories specifically? I know that's a big one for our listeners, and myself included.
Absolutely. Dr. Suzuki dove into the science of memory formation, and she highlighted 4 key factors that make things stick. The first, and perhaps the most fundamental, is repetition.
All right, no surprise there. Practice makes perfect. But in a world of instant gratification and endless distractions, remembering to actually repeat and rehearse information can be tough. It's not exactly the sexiest brain hack out there.
It might not be glamorous, but it's incredibly effective. Think about how you learned your multiplication tables or memorized those historical dates for school. It took time, and yes, a lot of repetition. The more we encounter information, the stronger those neural pathways become.
So how do we escape this need for repetition? Is there a shortcut?
Well, not a shortcut exactly, but Dr. Suzuki is a big fan of a technique called the memory palace, which taps into the power of association. Essentially, you link the information you want to remember with a familiar location, like your childhood home, and mentally place those items within that space.
So let's say I'm trying to remember a grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread, bananas. I'd imagine each item in a specific spot in my house. Like maybe the milk is spilling out of the refrigerator, the eggs are nestled in my old toy box, the bread is, well, you get the picture.
Precisely. And the more vivid and unusual the image, the more memorable it will be. Our brains love novelty.
It's like giving our brains a mental treasure map.
Exactly. And that treasure map is way more effective if it leads to, like, a giant rubber chicken or a singing banana.
All right.
The more unexpected or humorous the image, the better. Our brains are wired to pay attention to the unusual. It's how we learn and adapt.
So repetition helps solidify those neural pathways, and association, especially when it involves something novel, makes it more fun. What else makes information stick?
The third factor is emotional resonance. Think about it, we rarely forget events that were tied to strong emotions, whether it's like a joyous occasion or a difficult experience.
That makes sense. I can still remember every detail of my high school graduation ceremony, but ask me what I had for dinner last Tuesday, and I'm like drawing a blank.
Exactly. Our emotions act like a highlighter pen for our memories. And the more intense the emotion, the brighter that highlight. This is because the amygdala, the part of our brain responsible for processing emotions, works closely with the hippocampus, our memory center.
So next time I'm trying to memorize something important, maybe I should try to attach some kind of emotional significance to it. Not sure how I'd go about doing that, but hey, it's worth a shot.
Right. It's about understanding how our brains work and using that knowledge to our advantage. Now, the fourth and final factor in memory formation is drum roll, please, sleep.
Ah, sleep, the holy grail of a well-functioning brain. But seriously, why is sleep so crucial for memory?
Well, imagine spending all day learning new things, experiencing the world, gathering information. Your brain is like a computer that's been running nonstop, downloading files, opening countless tabs.
Sounds familiar. So sleep is like hitting the save button on all that new information.
Precisely. Sleep, especially deep sleep, is when our brains go into consolidation mode. Those short-term memories we've gathered throughout the day get transferred to long-term storage. It's like hitting that save button, making sure those memories don't just disappear.
Okay, that makes so much sense. But what about those nights when we're forced to pull an all-nighter or just don't get enough sleep? What's happening in our brains then?
Think of it this way. When we're sleep deprived, our brains don't get a chance to, clean house. All those metabolic byproducts, those little bits of brain gunk, start to accumulate. And that gunk can interfere with our brain's ability to function optimally. It's like trying to run a marathon with a backpack full of rocks.
Yikes, that's a visual. So we've covered the brain boosters exercise, challenging our minds, and getting enough sleep. But what about the things that can sabotage our brain power? You know, the brain busters.
Let's talk about those. We already touched on sleep deprivation, which is a major culprit. But another big one, and this might surprise you, is social isolation.
Really? Loneliness can actually harm our brains. I mean, I know it's not great for our mental health, but our brains too.
Unfortunately, yes, we are social creatures by nature. Our brains thrive on connection. And when we're deprived of those interactions, those real-life connections that stimulate our brains and make us feel alive, it can
Yeah.
have a detrimental effect on our cognitive function.
So what's the antidote? Just more face-to-face time with friends and family.
Exactly. Putting down the phone, stepping away from the screen, and engaging in meaningful conversations, even if it's just with, a barista or a cashier. It all adds up.
And what about social media? I mean, it does connect us in a way. Is it inherently bad for our brains?
It's complicated. Social media can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it does provide a sense of connection and can be a great way to stay in touch with friends and family, especially those far away. It can also expose us to new ideas and information, which is stimulating for our brains.
There's always a but with social media, isn't there?
But, and this is a big but, excessive use, especially the kind that leads us down those rabbit holes of comparison and negativity, can be incredibly detrimental to our mental and cognitive well-being.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with these curated versions of other people's lives, which can make us feel inadequate, anxious, even depressed. And that can't be good for our brains.
It's all about balance. Social media can be a tool, but it's important to use it mindfully, to be aware of how it makes us feel, and to prioritize real-world connections whenever possible.
Speaking of things that aren't good for us, what about those classic brain busters? Smoking, excessive alcohol consumption, poor diet.
Those definitely deserve a spot on the avoid at all costs list. These habits directly damage brain cells and impair cognitive function.
So no surprise there. They're bad for our bodies and bad for our brains. But Dr. Suzuki didn't seem to be totally anti-caffeine. She even talked about using it strategically for a little boost.
She did. She emphasized the importance of self-experimentation, paying attention to how different substances affect us individually.
So if that morning cup of coffee helps you feel sharper and more focused, go for it. But if you're relying on endless cups just to get through the day, that's probably a sign to reassess.
Exactly. And what about diet? Any recommendations there?
She's a big advocate for the Mediterranean diet, which emphasizes whole foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, healthy fats, and lean protein. It's basically a recipe for a happy brain.
Now, this next part might seem like a bit of a shift, but I think it's an essential aspect of this whole brain health equation. We've been talking about neurons, brain regions, the physical stuff. But what about the more intangible aspects of our mental lives? Things like spirituality, meaning, purpose.
That's an interesting point. It's like we can have the healthiest brain in the world, but if we're not feeling a sense of purpose or connection to something larger than ourselves, does it really matter?
Dr. Suzuki actually touched upon this very idea. She spoke about how her own views on spirituality have evolved over time. As a scientist, she's always been driven by data and evidence. But as she's journeyed deeper into the world of neuroscience, she's come to appreciate the limitations of a purely scientific approach, especially when it comes to understanding the complexities of human consciousness.
So she's not saying science has all the answers.
Not at all. She acknowledged that there might be aspects of our existence, certain truths or realities, that science can't fully explain or quantify. And that's okay. It leaves room for wonder, for mystery, for a sense of something greater than ourselves.
That resonates with me. It's like, even with all our scientific advancements, there are still those fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of life, that science alone can't fully answer. It's like science gives us the how, and maybe spirituality, or whatever we choose to call it, gives us the why.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And it speaks to this idea that we don't have to choose between like a scientific and a spiritual perspective. We can embrace both. They can coexist, even complement each other.
It's about acknowledging that we're dealing with one of the most complex, mysterious entities in the universe, our own brains. We've learned so much, but there's still so much we don't know.
And that's okay. That sense of mystery, that constant unfolding of knowledge is what makes this whole field so fascinating. It's a reminder to stay curious, to keep asking questions, and to remain open to new ways of understanding this incredible gift we've been given our brains.
So where does this leave us after diving deep into the world of brain health with Dr. Suzuki? We've covered a lot of ground brain plasticity, the impact of exercise and sleep, the importance of social connection, even the potential role of spirituality.
It might seem like a lot to process, but I think it boils down to this. We have more power than we realize when it comes to shaping our own brains. Every day we're making choices, consciously or unconsciously, that impact our brain health.
It's both empowering and a little daunting, right? Like, no pressure, but our daily habits are literally shaping the physical structure of our brains.
Exactly. But that awareness, that sense of agency, is where the real magic happens. Because once we understand the incredible potential of our brains and the factors that influence them, we can make conscious choices to support their well-being.
So it's not just about cramming our brains with information, it's about creating the optimal conditions for those brains to thrive. Getting enough sleep, moving our bodies, connecting with others in meaningful ways, and maybe even tapping into that sense of wonder and awe that connects us to something larger than ourselves.
Beautifully said. It's about recognizing that brain health is a lifelong journey, not a destination. There's no finish line. It's about cultivating those habits and practices that support us in becoming the best, most vibrant versions of ourselves.
It's like Dr. Suzuki said, it's about fostering that big, fat, fluffy brain. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. If you could strengthen one aspect of your brain, memory, focus, emotional regulation, creativity, what would it be and why? Think about it, explore it, and let's keep those beautiful brains buzzing.